The lanterns went out one by one as the search party reached the rim. 12 men from Comfort Hollow, Texas, stood in a loose half-circle around a black mouth in the earth that locals had feared since before any of them were born. A sinkhole so deep that a dropped stone took nearly 4 full seconds to hit water below. It was October of 1958, and they were not looking for a lost calf or a strayed mule. They were looking for their priest. What they found instead, folded neatly on a limestone ledge 8 feet down, was his black cassock, buttoned, brushed clean, placed as if he'd simply stepped out of it and kept walking into the dark. No body, no blood. No sign that a man weighing 170 pounds had ever gone over that edge at all. One of the men would later tell the county sheriff that it looked less like a man had fallen, and more like a man had been asked to leave something behind before he was allowed to go on. Before this story is finished, you'll understand why the old families of Edwards County still won't say his name after dark, and why, before we go any further, we want to know where in the world you're watching this from tonight. Type your city below. Somewhere out there, someone may already know exactly how this one ends. Comfort Hollow doesn't exist on any Texas road map printed after 1970, but in the autumn of 1958 it was a real cluster of stone houses and cedar post fences pressed against the western edge of Edwards County, close enough to the Devil's Sinkhole that ranch children were taught its name before they were taught to read. The chapel sat behind a stand of live oaks half a mile outside town, a squat building of hand-cut limestone with a bell tower too small for its bell, built in 1911 by families who'd walked north from the Rio Grande with nothing but tools, faith, and a statue of the Virgin wrapped in a wool blanket. By 1958, it had one priest, Father Anselm Cruz, 44 years old, who had come to the parish 9 years earlier and never once asked for a transfer, though the diocese in San Antonio offered him one twice. Once after a bad drought year, once after his own bishop worried, gently, that a man alone in that country for too long might start to lose the thread back to the wider church. Father Cruz stayed anyway. He lived in 2 small rooms behind the sacristy, ate what the ranch families brought him, and drove a battered 1949 Ford pickup with a cracked windshield down 40 miles of Caliche Road every other Sunday to say Mass in 3 separate chapels scattered across the county. People trusted him in the particular hard-earned way that isolated communities trust a man who is chosen again and again, year after year, to stay when he didn't have to. Chapter 1. The trouble started with Dolores Vance, though nobody in Comfort Hollow would say her name out loud for the better part of a decade afterward. She was 39 years old, married to a rancher named Earl Vance who ran cattle on 1,100 acres bordering the Sinkhole property, and she had, in the words of her sister-in-law Ruth, always been the calmest woman God ever put breath into. That was what made it frightening. It wasn't that Dolores had grown sad or strange or withdrawn, the kind of gradual change a doctor in San Antonio might have had a name for. It was that something in her had, over the course of about 3 weeks that September, begun to speak in a register that didn't belong to her at all. Earl noticed it first at supper, when she answered a simple question about the garden in a voice pitched a full octave lower than her own, and laughed afterward as though nothing had happened. He noticed it again 2 nights later, when he woke to find her standing at the foot of their bed in the dark, perfectly still, watching him sleep. He told only Father Cruz, and only after dark, driving her out to the chapel in the bed of his truck wrapped in a quilt, because by that point she would no longer sit upright in the cab beside him. He didn't want the sheriff involved. He didn't want a doctor's diagnosis written into a county record that his children would have to live under for the rest of their lives, in a place where such a record followed a family for 2 generations. What he wanted, what everyone in that country still wanted in 1958, when the nearest hospital with anything resembling a psychiatric ward was 3 hours east on roads that flooded twice a year, was a priest who would simply, quietly, make it stop. Father Cruz met them at the chapel door alone near midnight, carrying a single oil lamp that threw more shadow than light across the yard. He later told only one person, his housekeeper, a widow named Adalia Reyes, 61 years old, who cooked his meals and swept his floor twice a week and had buried a husband and 2 brothers in that same chapel's small cemetery, what he saw in the bed of that truck. He never told her the specific words. He told her only that Dolores Vance's eyes had found his in the dark before Earl had even cut the engine, and that she had smiled at him the way a person smiles at someone they have been waiting a very long time to see again. Adalia would repeat this single detail, almost against her own will, to the search party investigators 11 days later, and it would be the piece of testimony that made even the most skeptical men among them go quiet and look at each other without speaking. If you're watching from a small town of your own, the kind where everyone still knows everyone's business by sundown, whether they want to or not, you already understand how fast a secret like this can travel, even when nobody says a single word out loud. Tell us your city in the comments below. Some of the best stories on this channel start with someone recognizing a place just like their own. What Father Cruz did in that chapel over the following 4 nights was never written down in any diocesan record, because what he did was not, strictly speaking, permitted by Rome or by San Antonio. The formal rite of exorcism required a bishop's written authorization, a psychiatric evaluation ruling out medical explanation, and a process that could take 4 months or longer to move through proper channels. And Dolores Vance, by every account, did not have 4 months. So Father Cruz did what circuit priests in isolated Texas parishes had quietly, unofficially done for generations before him. He combined the Latin prayers he'd learned at seminary in San Antonio with older ones, prayers his own grandmother had taught him in Spanish before he ever wore a Roman collar, prayers that blurred the careful line between official church rite and the older folk Catholicism of the borderlands, the kind practiced by curanderas and rural healers up and down the Rio Grande for 2 centuries before any bishop set foot in that country. Adalia said she heard chanting through the sacristy wall on the 2nd and 3rd nights, low, continuous, unbroken for hours at a stretch, and unmistakably in 2 voices, though only Father Cruz and Dolores were present in that locked room. On the 4th night, she said, there came a silence so total, so sudden, that she went to the chapel door out of pure fear that something had gone terribly wrong, and found Father Cruz alone at the altar rail, kneeling, weeping without any sound at all, his shoulders shaking, and Dolores Vance sitting calmly in the front pew behind him, folding her own hands in her lap, looking, by Adalia's account, entirely, ordinarily herself again for the first time in 3 weeks. Adalia never went inside that night. She stood at the door a long moment, she said, watching the 2 of them in the candlelight, the priest still kneeling, the woman still seated, neither one speaking, neither one moving toward the other. And then she quietly pulled the door closed again and walked back to her own small house at the edge of the property, where she sat up until dawn with a rosary in her hands, though she could never afterward say exactly what she had been praying for. It was not relief, she told investigators years later. It had not felt in that moment like something had ended. It had felt, she said, more like something had simply been asked to wait. Earl Vance came for his wife at first light the next morning, and Father Cruz met him at the truck himself, looking, by Earl's account, 10 years older than he had 4 nights before. He told Earl only that Dolores was well, that whatever had troubled her had gone, and that Earl should take her home and let her rest, and not speak of the matter to anyone in town, for her own sake and for the sake of the family's good name. Earl thanked him, pressed a folded bill into his hand that Father Cruz quietly refused, and drove his wife home in the pale early light without either of them saying a word the entire way. Word of the exorcism itself never reached the wider town outright, not in any open sense. Comfort Hollow was small enough that outright gossip could ruin a family standing for a generation, and it was large enough at the same time that everyone still knew, in the vague, half-spoken way small towns always seem to know things, that something out of the ordinary had happened at the chapel that particular week. Nobody asked Earl Vance about it directly. Nobody asked Father Cruz either. The silence itself became, in its own quiet way, a kind of unspoken agreement across the whole community. Whatever had taken place behind that chapel door would stay behind that chapel door, and life on the surface of things would simply go on exactly as if nothing at all had changed. Chapter 2. For 9 days it seemed to have worked completely. Dolores returned to the Vance ranch house and resumed her life with an ordinariness that Earl would later describe, almost apologetically, as too complete, as though she had returned not merely to health but to a kind of untroubled, weightless calm that even healthy people rarely carry for long. She cooked. She tended her garden along the south wall of the house. She attended Sunday Mass and knelt in the same pew she always had, and sang the same hymns in the same slightly off key she'd always sung them in. And Earl told Ruth privately that he had never in 11 years of marriage seen his wife look so thoroughly, peacefully at rest. Father Cruz, for his part, said nothing to his own parish about what had happened. He resumed his regular rounds to the other 2 chapels under his care, 40 miles of Caliche road each way, and by all outward appearances returned to the same steady rhythm of life he'd kept for 9 years. But he did write one letter in that period, a single letter to a former seminary classmate, now a parish priest in Laredo, a letter that survives today in a private family collection and reads, in part, that he had done something for a family in need that I am not certain I had the authority or the strength to do, and I do not yet know what it will cost either of us. He signed it, as he always did, simply Anselmo, and asked his friend to pray for him, though he did not say for what. That letter was postmarked 6 days before he disappeared. On the 10th day after the exorcism, a 15-year-old altar boy named Tomas Herrera, who lit the chapel candles before evening devotions each night, told his mother he had seen Dolores Vance standing at the tree line behind the chapel just after dusk. Not approaching the building, not calling out, simply standing among the live oaks in her house dress, with her arms at her sides, watching it with a stillness he found impossible to describe except to say that the ranch's own cattle, grazing nearby, had moved as one to the far end of the pasture and would not come near that fence line at all that evening or the following morning. Tomas did not tell Father Cruz what he'd seen. He told only his mother, who told Ruth Vance, who, after considerable hesitation and against Earl's wishes, rode out early the next morning to check on her sister-in-law and found Dolores in her kitchen, entirely composed, humming to herself over a pot of coffee, and by her own account entirely unaware of having left the ranch house the previous evening at all. Earl Vance later insisted, to anyone who asked, that his wife had been home with him the whole night, asleep beside him. He was certain of it, he said, and grew angry when pressed further. And yet 3 separate people in Comfort Hollow, Tomas, a ranch hand named Delfino Ortiz, who worked the Vance's eastern fence line and slept in a bunkhouse close enough to see the chapel tree line from his window, and eventually Idalia Reyes herself, would each independently describe a figure near that same tree line in the days that followed. A figure some took without much hesitation for Dolores, and a figure others, tellingly, would not commit to identifying at all, no matter how directly the sheriff's men asked them later. Where are you watching this from tonight? If your own hometown has ever had a story people still whisper about decades after it happened, you already know exactly the kind of quiet that fell over Comfort Hollow that week, the kind where nobody says anything out loud, but everyone somehow already knows. Drop your city below. It genuinely helps us understand how far these old Texas stories are still traveling, 60-odd years later. Father Cruz changed after that week. Idalia noticed it first in his appetite. He stopped finishing the meals she cooked for him, then stopped starting them at all, until she began leaving plates covered on his desk that he would not touch even the following morning. She noticed it in his sleep, or lack of it. He began keeping a lit candle burning in his room every single night, a habit she had never once seen him practice in the 9 years she had cooked and cleaned for him. And twice in that final week, she found him standing at his bedroom window well past midnight, fully dressed, simply looking out toward the tree line and the Sinkhole property beyond it, saying nothing at all for what she estimated afterward, guessing, to be an hour or more at a stretch. She asked him once, on the second of those nights, what exactly he was watching for. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, he told her only that he kept thinking of something his own grandmother used to say to him as a boy back in Eagle Pass, that a door, once opened for the wrong reasons, doesn't simply swing shut on its own again just because a person wants it to. Idalia asked him carefully whether he believed Dolores Vance was still troubled in some way. He told her no, that Dolores herself was entirely well now, completely at peace, and that this, in its own strange way, was precisely the part that frightened him the most. He would not explain the thought any further, and Idalia did not ask him to, though she found herself turning that single answer over in her mind for the rest of her own long life. Chapter 3. 3 days before he vanished, Father Cruz drove into the town of Rock Springs, the nearest settlement large enough to have its own post office and general store, and did something that struck the elderly postmaster, a man named Verlin Aycock, as strange enough to remember with total clarity when investigators asked him about it nearly 2 weeks later. He mailed 2 letters at once, in the same visit, standing at the counter for a long moment before he handed them over, as if debating whether to send them at all. One was addressed to the bishop's office in San Antonio. The other was addressed to his sister in Del Rio, a woman named Consuelo Cruz Marin, who had not heard a word from her brother in almost a year, and would later say she nearly didn't open it, thinking it might simply be another of his brief, dutiful holiday notes. The letter to the bishop has never been recovered. Diocesan records from that period were badly damaged in a rectory fire in San Antonio in 1971, and whether the letter ever arrived at all, or what it said, or whether anyone in the diocese ever read it and did nothing, remains one of the open, unanswered threads of this entire case. The letter to Consuelo survived, and survives still, folded into a small cedar box kept by her descendants. In it, Father Cruz wrote that he believed he had opened a door in that woman that I do not have the authority to close again, and that he intended, in the coming days, to go alone to speak with the old man at the Sinkhole ranch, a phrase investigators would spend a full day trying to identify, since no ranch by that exact description appeared on any county survey map available to them at the time. They eventually concluded, after cross-referencing land deeds at the county courthouse, that he meant a reclusive rancher named Otto Baumgartner, 81 years old, whose 1,100-acre property bordered the Sinkhole on its northern edge, and who was, by long-standing local reputation, the last living person in the county who still remembered the older stories about the Sinkhole, stories predating even the Spanish mission era, passed down second-hand through the Baumgartner family from Comanche and Lipan Apache, accounts his own grandfather had collected out of simple curiosity back in the 1870s. Stories of the Sinkhole as a place where sound itself behaved wrongly, where a shout thrown down into the shaft sometimes returned, moments later, as a different voice entirely, in a different register, saying something the original shout had never contained. Whether Father Cruz ever actually reached Otto Baumgartner's property that week is one of the enduring, unresolved threads of this case, and it very nearly went unrecorded altogether. Baumgartner himself, when finally questioned by the sheriff's investigators 11 days after the disappearance, said only that a man matching the priest's description had come to stand at his gate at dusk 3 evenings before Father Cruz vanished, had asked him a single question, which Baumgartner flatly refused to repeat to investigators, citing it, in his exact words, as a matter between the man and his God, and none of the county's business, and had then simply turned and walked back down the long caliche road toward the chapel without waiting for any answer at all. Baumgartner did offer investigators one further piece of information, volunteered rather than asked for, that made its way into Sheriff Kessler's notes, though not into his final public report. He said that his grandfather's old account of the sinkhole, the one about sound returning wrong, about a shout answered by a different voice, had always included a second detail the family rarely repeated, because it unsettled even them, that whatever answered back from the shaft could apparently be asked, under very particular and poorly understood conditions, to take something out of a person and hold it for a while, the way a well might hold water, but that nothing, in the old stories, was ever said to come out of that ground for free, and nothing was ever said to stay down there for very long before it came looking for whoever had gone to fetch it back out in the first place. Baumgartner told investigators he did not believe a word of it himself, and had not believed it since he was a boy of 10. He said this, according to Kessler's own handwritten notes, while standing at his own gate, deliberately not looking toward the sinkhole property visible over his north fence line, some 3/4 of a mile off in the distance. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer who deserves to know how deep this one goes before we reach the search itself. Comment your city below. We read every single one, and we're slowly building a map of exactly how far this particular Texas story has traveled by the time it's finished. The night before he disappeared, Idalia Reyes cooked him a meal he did not touch at all, and found him afterward not at his window, this time but outside, standing alone in the chapel yard in the pitch dark, facing the tree line, fully dressed in his cassock, even though there was no mass scheduled and no reason for him to be wearing it. She asked him gently if he was well. He told her, and this is the last verified thing Father Anselm Cruz is known to have said to another living person, that he did not think the door had closed all the way behind Dolores Vance, and that he intended to make certain of it himself, alone, before anyone else in Comfort Hollow paid the price for what he had done, quietly and without authorization, in that chapel 3 weeks before. Chapter 4. Idalia Reyes was the last person to see Father Cruz alive. At approximately 6:15 the following evening, walking east from the chapel along the fence line toward the sinkhole property with no lantern in hand, though full dark was less than an hour away, and he knew that stretch of caliche well enough to know it too. She called after him twice. He raised one hand without turning around. Whether in simple acknowledgment or to wave her off entirely, she could never afterward say with any certainty, and it would trouble her for the rest of her life, and continued walking at an even, unhurried pace until the live oaks along the property line swallowed him from view entirely. When he had not returned by 9 o'clock, Idalia walked to the Vance ranch house herself, on foot, in the full dark, nearly 1.5 miles along the same road, to wake Earl Vance and tell him something was badly wrong. Earl and 2 ranch hands searched the immediate chapel grounds that first night with hand lanterns, and found nothing at all. No sign of the priest, no dropped object, nothing but the ordinary dark quiet of a rural property at night. It was not until the following morning, when Delfino Ortiz walked the sinkhole rim as a matter of daily habit while checking the eastern fence line for storm damage, that Father Cruz's cassock was finally discovered, folded with careful precision, buttoned from collar to hem, and set squarely upon a narrow limestone ledge, roughly 8 feet below the surface rim, on a shelf of rock that required a careful, deliberate, hand-over-hand climb down to reach at all. It was not, by any stretch, a place a man could simply fall to by accident while walking too close to an edge in the dark. It was a place a man would have to consciously choose to descend to, and then choose, quite deliberately, to leave something behind there before continuing further downward, or before something else continued on for him. Sheriff Wade Kessler of Edwards County organized a formal search that same afternoon, drawing on local ranch hands, 2 off-duty sheriff's deputies driven in from Rock Springs, and, After 2 full days of fruitless searching along the surface in the immediate rim, a pair of experienced cavers from a spelunking club in Austin, brought in specifically because the sinkhole's vertical shaft dropped roughly 140 feet straight down to an unstable floor of bat guano and loose breakdown rubble, far beyond anything a local search party could safely attempt to reach without proper climbing rope and rigging. What the cavers found on their very first full descent into the shaft was this: no body anywhere along the drop or on the cave floor below, no personal effects beyond the cassock already recovered at the upper ledge, and, scratched into a section of exposed limestone wall roughly 60 feet down, in a hand far too deliberate and evenly spaced to be accidental, a set of marks that Sheriff Kessler's official written report described only as irregular scoring, cause undetermined. Idalia Reyes, shown a photograph of those same marks several weeks later by a visiting county clerk, went very quiet and said only that they reminded her of something, though she flatly refused to say what and never spoke of the photograph again to anyone who asked. Delfino Ortiz, the ranch hand who had found the folded cassock that first morning, was asked by Sheriff Kessler to walk the rim once more with him, slowly, to point out exactly where he had stood and exactly what he had seen. Delfino did so, but refused, according to Kessler's own notes, to climb down to the ledge itself a second time, even in broad daylight with 3 other men present and a rope secured to a nearby fence post. He told the sheriff plainly that he had felt, standing on that ledge the first morning, an unmistakable sense of being watched from somewhere below him in the dark, not from the rim above, where the rest of the search party stood, but from underneath, from somewhere inside the shaft itself, and that no amount of daylight was going to convince him to stand there a second time. Kessler wrote the statement down without comment, the same way he wrote down most things that week that he didn't quite know what else to do with. We'll get to exactly what the cavers heard on their second descent in just a moment. But first, tell us where you're watching from tonight. This particular story is about to go somewhere very few Texas mystery channels are willing to follow it, and we genuinely want to know who's still with us this far in. On the second descent, conducted the following morning with fresh rope and 2 additional cavers brought in from San Antonio, one of the men, a 26-year-old named Hollis Pratt, who would give a full signed statement to Sheriff Kessler within the week, reported hearing, from somewhere below the reach of his own lantern light, a voice calling out a single name. Not his own name. Not the name of any man on the search party. He would later tell Kessler, with obvious and lasting reluctance, that the voice had called out Dolores, twice, clearly, from a depth his equipment simply could not illuminate, in a register he described, when pressed, only as not right for down there, not right for anywhere a person's supposed to be. Chapter 5. The formal search continued for 6 more days after that second descent. Cavers went down the shaft 4 additional times over the course of that week, mapping roughly 200 feet of connected passage below the main vertical drop, guided by county survey maps that had never before been drawn with anything approaching this degree of detail. Maps that exist today in the Edwards County Courthouse archive and are, according to the 2 surviving cavers interviewed decades later for a regional oral history project, more thorough than anything done down there since, because nobody much wanted to go back after that particular week. They found no further remains anywhere in the mapped passages. They found no further sign of Father Cruz beyond the folded cassock and the scoring on the limestone wall, which a University of Texas geologist consulted the following year, in 1959, would attribute in a brief and somewhat dismissive written report to natural weathering patterns consistent with mineral seepage and periodic flooding, a tidy conclusion the 2 cavers who had actually seen the marks up close, by lantern light, 60 feet underground, never fully accepted for the rest of their lives. Sheriff Kessler called off the official search on the 9th day, citing both the exhaustion of his volunteers and the genuine physical danger of continuing to send men down an unstable shaft with no further leads to justify the risk. His final written report, filed with the county and later summarized in a single terse paragraph in the San Antonio Diocesan Newsletter, listed Father Anselm Cruz simply as missing, cause and circumstances undetermined. No death certificate was ever issued in the years that followed. Under Texas law at the time, a formal declaration of death in absentia required a full 7 years without any confirmed sign of the missing person. And Comfort Hollow, as it turned out, was not entirely finished seeing signs even after the search itself had ended. Dolores Vance left the ranch with Earl and their 2 children 11 months later, relocating to a town near Corpus Christi, where Earl had found steady work in the oil fields. Ruth Vance, interviewed decades afterward for a regional folklore archive project out of a small Texas university, said her sister-in-law was never quite the same distance from herself again after that particular autumn. Not troubled exactly, not strange in any way a doctor could put a proper name to, but carrying, in Ruth's own words, a kind of quiet like she was listening for something the rest of us simply couldn't hear and never would. Dolores herself gave exactly 1 interview on the entire subject in her lifetime in 1974, 16 years after the disappearance, to a graduate student collecting oral histories of Edwards County ranch families. In it, she confirmed, plainly and without visible distress, that the exorcism had in fact taken place. She confirmed that she had felt, in the weeks afterward, an overwhelming sense of calm she could not fully explain or account for, even to herself. And she said one further thing, recorded on reel-to-reel tape that survives today in a small university archive, that in the months after Father Cruz disappeared, she had, on 3 separate nights, dreamed of standing at the rim of the sinkhole looking down into it, and had felt, in the dream, and only ever in the dream, that something down there was patiently waiting for her to come back and finish a conversation that had been interrupted before it was ever properly resolved. She refused to say anything further on the subject that day, thanked the graduate student for his time, and declined every later request for a follow-up interview until her death in 1991, at the age of 72. That same graduate student, a young folklore researcher named Peter Alderman, would go on to spend the better part of the following decade chasing down the remaining threads of the case almost as a private obsession, well after his original oral history project had been submitted and filed away. He tracked down Thomas Herrera, by then a grown man running a feed store in Rock Springs, who confirmed everything he had told his mother as a boy in 1958, and added, almost as an afterthought, that he had never once in the intervening years gone near that stretch of tree line after dark, not even as an adult, not even when his own truck broke down on that same road one winter night, and he had to walk the last mile home in the cold rather than cut through the pasture. He tracked down Sheriff Wade Kessler as well, retired by then and living quietly in Kerrville, who agreed to speak with him only once, off the record, and told him that in 31 years of law enforcement across 3 counties, the Cruz disappearance was the only case file he had ever personally requested be sealed rather than simply closed. Not because he believed there was anything supernatural in it, he insisted, but because he had never once, in 3 decades, been able to write a final report he actually believed himself. Alderman's notes, later donated to the same university archive that holds Dolores Vance's recorded interview, include one further detail that never made it into any official record at the time. In the spring of 1959, some 6 months after the search was called off, a ranch hand repairing fence near the sinkhole's northern edge reported finding a single page of handwritten Spanish, water-damaged and partially illegible, wedged into a crevice of rock roughly 40 feet down inside the shaft, far below where the cassock had been recovered, and well below where either cave-in team had reported finding footholds accessible to an ordinary man without rope and rigging. The page was brought to the surface, shown briefly to Idalia Reyes, who confirmed the handwriting was Father Cruz's own, and then, according to Alderman's notes, was quietly given to the diocese and was never seen or referenced again by anyone outside church records. What the page said, if anything could still be read of it at all, has never been made public. If a story like this one exists somewhere near where you actually live, something your own grandparents wouldn't talk about at the dinner table, something that still quietly shapes how a small town behaves after the sun goes down, we genuinely want to hear it. Tell us your city, and if you happen to know the story itself, go ahead and tell us that too. We read every comment. Chapter 6. The chapel outside Comfort Hollow was formally deconsecrated by the diocese in 1963, 5 years after Father Cruz's disappearance, following a general decline in the surrounding ranching community, and, according to one retired diocesan administrator interviewed for a 2003 regional history project, an unusual and persistent reluctance among the remaining families to request any replacement priest for that particular building, even a visiting one. The limestone structure still stands today on private ranch land, roofless since a severe windstorm in the early 1980s, its small bell tower long since collapsed into rubble, accessible now only with the current landowner's direct permission. Comfort Hollow itself was absorbed administratively into the town of Rock Springs by the mid-1970s and no longer appears as a distinct place name on any modern map, though longtime Edwards County families still use the name freely in ordinary conversation, the way people often do with a place that has technically stopped existing on paper, but has never quite stopped existing in memory, or in the way a story gets told at a kitchen table. The Devil's Sinkhole itself became an officially designated Texas State Natural Area in 2002, managed today primarily for its considerable ecological value. It remains one of the largest known bat maternity roosts anywhere in North America, home to well over 1 million Mexican free-tailed bats each summer, a genuine natural spectacle that draws visitors from across the country. It is, by every honest account, a place of striking natural beauty, visited today by hikers and bird watchers and school groups with no knowledge whatsoever of what one exhausted search party spent 9 long days failing to find down there in the autumn of 1958. Guided tours are offered today by reservation through Texas Parks and Wildlife, and none of the official visitor literature mentions Father Anselm Cruz or Dolores Vance or any of what happened in that country 60-odd years ago at all. No physical trace of him was ever found, then or since. No further remains, no additional correspondence beyond the 2 letters already known to survive, no confirmed sighting of any kind anywhere in Texas or across the border in Mexico in the more than 60 years since. Otto Baumgartner died quietly on his own property in 1966, having never once repeated to anyone the single question the priest had asked him at his gate that final week. Idalia Reyes lived until 1979 and reportedly kept a small candle burning in her front window on the anniversary of his disappearance every single year until her own death, regardless of who asked her why. And Hollis Pratt, the young caver who heard a voice calling out a name that didn't belong to anyone standing on the surface, gave his very last interview on the subject in 2009, 3 years before his own death, in which he said only this, that he had spent 51 full years trying, and largely failing, to convince himself it had simply been an echo, some ordinary trick of stone and depth and a tired man's imagination, and 51 years quietly failing to fully believe his own explanation. What actually happened to Father Anselm Cruz in the last hour before he vanished from the face of the earth? Whether he found precisely what he'd gone looking for in Otto Baumgartner's inherited stories, whether the plain, unforgiving geology of an unstable Texas sinkhole simply claimed a grieving, sleepless man walking too close to an unmarked edge in the dark, or whether something that truly did follow Dolores Vance home from that chapel waited patiently for the one man in Comfort Hollow willing to face it alone, on its own ground, at its own hour, remains today exactly where Sheriff Wade Kessler's original 1958 report left it, in 4 plain words, cause and circumstances undetermined. There is one final piece of this story worth telling before we close it out. In the summer of 1988, 30 years after Father Cruz walked east along that fence line and never came back, a small maintenance crew doing preliminary survey work ahead of the site's eventual state park designation lowered a modern camera rig into the shaft to document its interior for conservation records, the first time anyone had gone down since the original search cavers in 1958. They found nothing new. No remains, no fabric, no further scoring beyond what earlier reports had already noted, now worn smoother by 3 more decades of seasonal flooding. But the crew's supervisor, a state parks employee named Grady Holcomb, who had grown up 2 counties over and had never heard the story before that summer, later told a colleague something he asked not be included in the official survey notes, that at roughly the same 60-foot depth where Hollis Pratt had once heard a voice calling a name that wasn't his, the camera's own audio pickup, a standard, unremarkable piece of 1980s equipment with no history of malfunction before or since, recorded 11 full seconds of what the crew's transcript describes only as indistinct low murmuring, source unidentified, no crew member speaking at time of recording. The tape, according to Holcomb, was logged, filed with the rest of the survey material, and has not been played publicly since. What actually happened to Father Anselm Cruz in the last hour before he vanished from the face of the earth, whether he found precisely what he'd gone looking for in Otto Baumgartner's inherited stories, whether the plain, unforgiving geology of an unstable Texas sinkhole simply claimed a grieving, sleepless man walking too close to an unmarked edge in the dark, or whether something that truly did follow Dolores Vance home from that chapel waited patiently for the one man in Comfort Hollow willing to face it alone, on its own ground, at its own hour, remains today exactly where Sheriff Wade Kessler's original 1958 report left it, in 4 plain words: cause and circumstances undetermined. If this is the kind of buried history your own hometown carries somewhere in its memory too, we'd genuinely like to know about it. Tell us your city one more time before you go. And if a story like this one ever happened near you, we might just be the ones to tell it next.